Famlui Eklawana Adulorali Fadago. Famlui Eklawana Adulorali Fadago. Famlui Eklawana Adulorali Fadago.
Welcome to the 217th of the Cthulhu podcasts. I'm Falbrick. Today we're starting off with the next part of Mr. Standfast. Then we'll have a musical number, and then back for the very last section from The King in Yellow. Let's get started. Chapter 14, Part 2. Next morning, in miserable sloppy weather, Blencaron carted me about Paris. We climbed 5 sets of stairs to a flat away in Montmartre, where I was talked to by a fat man with spectacles and a slow voice, and told various things that deeply concerned me. Then I went to a room in the Boulevard Saint-Germain, with a little cabinet opening off of it, where I was shown papers and maps and some figures on a sheet of paper that made me open my eyes. We lunched in a modest café, tucked away behind the Palais Royal, and our companions were 2 Alsatians, who spoke German better than a Boche and had no names, only numbers. In the afternoon I went to a low building besides the Invalides, and saw many generals, including more than one whose features were familiar in 2 hemispheres. I told them everything about myself, and I was examined like a convict, and all particulars about my appearance and manner of speech written down in a book. This was to prepare the way for me, in case of need, among the vast army of those who work underground and know their chief but do not know each other. The rain cleared before night, and Blencaron and I walked back to the hotel through that lemon-coloured dusk that you get in a French winter. We passed a company of American soldiers, and Blencaron had to stop and stare. I could see that he was stiff with pride, though he wouldn't show it. "What do you think of that bunch?" he asked. "First-rate stuff," I said. "The men are all right," he drawled critically, "but some of the officer boys are a bit puffy. They want fining down." "They'll get it soon enough, honest fellows. You don't keep your weight long in this war." "Say, Dick," he said shyly, "what do you truly think of our Americans? You've seen a lot of them, and I'd value your views." His tone was that of a bashful author asking for an opinion on his first book. "I'll tell you what I think. You're constructing a great middle-class army, and that's the most formidable fighting machine on earth. This kind of war doesn't want the berserker so much as the quiet fellow with a trained mind and a lot to fight for. The American ranks are filled with all sorts, from cow-punchers to college boys, but mostly with decent lads that have good prospects in life before them, and are fighting because they feel they're bound to, not because they like it. It was the same stock that pulled through your Civil War. We have a middle-class division too, Scottish territorials, mostly clerks and shopmen and engineers and farmers' sons. When I first struck them, my only crab was that the officers weren't much better than the men. Still true, but the men are super excellent, and consequently, so are the officers. That division gets top marks in the Boche calendar for sheer fighting devilment, and please God, that's what your American army's going to be. You can wash out the old idea of a regiment of scallywags commanded by dukes. That was right enough maybe in the days when you hurrooshed into battle with waving a banner, but it don't do with high explosives and a couple of million men on each side and a battle front of 500 miles. The hero of this war is the plain man out of the middle class, who wants to get back to his home and is going to use all the brains and grit he possesses to finish the job soon." "That sounds about right," said Blencaron reflectively. "It pleases me some, for you maybe guessed that I respect the British Army quite a little. Which part of it do you put top?" "All of it's good. The French are keen judges, and they give front place to the Scots and the Australians. For myself, I think the backbone of the army is the old-fashioned English country regiment that hardly ever gets into the papers. Though I don't know if I had to pick, but I'd take the South Africans. There's only a brigade of them, but they're hell's delight in battle. But then you'll say I'm prejudiced." "Well," drawled Blencaron, "you're a mighty empire anyhow. I've sojourned up and down it, and I can't guess how the old-time highbrows in your little island come to put it together. But I'll let you into a secret, Dick. I read this morning in a newspaper that there was a natural affinity between Americans and the men of the British Dominions. Take it from me, there isn't, at least not with this American. I don't understand them one little bit. When I see your lean, tall Australians with the sun at the back of their eyes, I'm looking at men from another planet. Outside you and Peter, I never got to fathom a South African. The Canadians live over the fence from us, but you mix up a Canuck and a Yank in your remarks, and you'll get a bat in the eye. But most of us Americans have gotten a grip on your old country. You'll find us mighty respectful to other parts of your empire, but we say anything we damn well please about England. You see, we know her that well, and like her that well. We can be free with her. It's like, he concluded as we reached the hotel, it's like a lot of boys that are getting in on the world and are a bit jealous and stand-offish with each other. But they're all at home with the old man who used to warm them up with a hickory cane, even though sometimes, in their haste, they call him a stand-patter. That night at dinner, we talked solid business. Blenkiron and I and a young French colonel from the 3rd M section at GQG. Blenkiron, I remember, got very hurt about being called a businessman by the Frenchman, who thought he was paying him a compliment. "Cut it out," he said. "It's a word that's gone bad with me. There's just two kind of men, those who've gotten sense and those who haven't. A big percentage of us Americans make our living by trading, but we don't think because he's a man in business, or even because he's made big money, that he's any natural good at every job. We've made a college professor our president, and do what he tells us like little boys, though he don't earn more than some of us pay our works managers. You English have gotten business on the brain and think a fellow's a dandy at handling your government if he happens to have made a pile by some flat-catching ramp on your stock exchange. Makes me tired. You're about the best business nation on earth, but for God's sake don't begin to talk about it, or you'll lose your power. And don't go confusing real business with the ordinary gift of raking in the dollars. Any man with sense could make money if he wanted to, but he mayn't want. He may prefer the fun of the job and let other people do the looting. I reckon the biggest business on the globe today is the work behind your lines, and the way you feed and supply and transport your army. It beats the Steel Corporation and the Standard Oil to a frazzle. But the man at the head of it all don't earn more than $1,000 a month. Your nation's getting to worship Mammon, Dick. Cut it out. There's just one difference in humanity, sense or no sense, and most likely you won't find any more sense in the man that makes $1 million selling bonds than in his brother Tim that lives in a shack and sells corn cobs. I'm not speaking out of sinful jealousy, for there was a day when I was reckoned a railroad king, and I quit with a bigger pile than kings usually retire on. But I haven't the sense of old Peter, who never earned or had a bank account, and it's sense that wins this war. The colonel, who spoke good English, asked a question about a speech which some politician had made. "There isn't all the sense I'd like to see at the top," said Blenkiron. "They're fine at smooth words, that wouldn't matter, but they're thinking smooth thoughts. What do you make of the situation, Dick?" "I think it's the worst since first Ypres," I said. "Everybody's cock-a-whoop, but God knows why." "God knows why," Blenkiron repeated. "I reckon it's a simple calculation, and you can't deny it any more than a mathematical law. Russia is counted out. The Boche won't get food from her for a good many months. But he can get more men, and he's got them. He's fighting only on one foot, and he's been able to bring troops and guns west, so he's as strong as the Allies now on paper. And he's stronger in reality. He's got better railways behind him, and he's fighting on inside lines, and can concentrate fast against any bit of our front. I'm no soldier, but that's so, isn't it, Dick?" The Frenchman smiled and shook his head. "All the same, they will not pass. They could not when they were 2-1 in 1914, and they will not now. If we Allies could not break through in the last year when we had many more men, how would the Germans succeed now with only equal numbers?" Blenkiron did not look convinced. "That's what they all say. I talked to a general last week about the coming offensive, and he said he was praying for it to hurry up, for he reckoned Fritz would get the fright of his life. It's a good spirit, maybe, but I don't think it's sound on the facts. We've got 2 mighty great armies of fine fighting men, but because we've 2 commands, we're bound to move ragged like a pearl of bells. The Hun's got 1 army, and 40 years of stiff tradition, and what's more, he's going all out this time. He's going to smash our front before America lines up or perish in the attempt. Why do you suppose all the peace racket in Germany has died down? And the very men that were talking democracy in the summer are now hot for fighting to finish. I'll tell you, it's because old Ludendorff has promised them complete victory this spring if they spend enough men. And the Boche is a good gambler, and he's out to risk it. We're not up against a local attack this time. We're standing up to a great nation going bald-headed for victory or destruction. If we're broken, then America's got to fight a new campaign by herself when she's ready, and the Boche has time to make Russia his feeding ground and diddle our blockade. That puts another 5 years onto the war, maybe another 10. Are we free and independent peoples going to endure that much? I tell you, we're tossing to quit before Easter. He turned towards me, and I nodded assent. That's more or less my view, I said. We ought to hold, but it'll be by our teeth and nails. For the next 6 months, we'll be fighting without any margin. But my friends, you put it too gravely, cried the Frenchman. We may lose a mile or 2 of ground, yes, but serious danger is not possible. They'd better chances at Verdun, and they failed. Why should they succeed now? Because they're stacking everything, Blenkiron replied. It's the last desperate struggle of a wounded beast, and in these struggles sometimes the hunter perishes. Dick's right. We've got a wasting margin, and every extra ounce of weight is going to tell. The battle's in the field, and it's also in every corner of every Allied land. That's why, within the next 2 months, we've got to get even with the wild birds. The French colonel, his name was de Valliere, smiled at the name, and Blenkiron answered my unspoken question. I'm going to satisfy some of your curiosity, Dick, for I've put together considerable news of the menagerie. Germany has a good army of spies throughout our borders. We shoot a batch now and then, but the others go on working, like beavers, and they do a mighty deal of harm. They're beautifully organized, but they don't draw on such good human material as we, and I reckon they don't pay in results more than 10 cents on the dollar of trouble. But there they are. They're the intelligence officers, and their business is just to forward news. They're the birds in the cage, what is it your friend called them? Die Stubenvogel, I said. Yes, but all the birds aren't caged. There's a few outside the bars, and they don't collect news. They do things. If there's anything desperate, they're put on the job, and they've got power to act without waiting on instructions from home. I've investigated until my brain's tired, and I haven't made out more than 6 of whom I can say for certain are in the business. There's your pal, that Portuguese Jew, Dick. There's another, a woman in Genoa, a princess of some sort, married to a Greek financier. One's the editor of a pro-Ally up-country paper in the Argentine. One passes as a Baptist minister in Colorado. One was a police spy in the Tsar's government and is now a red-hot revolutionary in the Caucasus. And the biggest, of course, is Moxon Ivory, who in happier times was the Graf von Schwabing. There aren't above 100 people in the world know of their existence, and these 100 call them the Wild Birds. Do they work together? I asked. Yes, and each get their own jobs to do, but they're apt to flock together for a big piece of devilment. There were 4 of them in France a year ago, before the Battle of Aisne, and they pretty near rotted the French army. That so, Colonel? The soldier nodded grimly. They seduced our weary troops, and they brought many politicians. Almost they succeeded, but not quite. The nation is sane again, and is judging the shooting and accomplices at its leisure. But the principals we have never caught. You hear that, Dick? Said Blenkiron. You're satisfied this isn't a whimsy of a melodramatic old Yank? I'll tell you more. You know how Ivory worked that submarine business from England? Also, it was the Wild Birds that wrecked Russia. It was Ivory that paid the Bolsheviks to seduce the army, and the Bolsheviks took his money for their own purpose, thinking they were playing a deep game, when all the time he was grinning like Satan, for they were playing his. It was Ivory, or some other of the bunch, that doped the brigades that broke at Caporetto. If I started in to tell you the history of their doings, you wouldn't go to bed. And if you did, you wouldn't sleep. There's just this to it. Every finished subtle devilry that the Boche has wrought amongst the Allies since August 1914 has been the work of the wild birds and more or less organised by Ivory. They're worth half a dozen army corps to Ludendorff. They're the mightiest poison merchants the world ever saw, and they've the nerve of hell. I don't know, I interrupted. Ivory's got his soft spot. I saw him in the tube station. Maybe, but he's got the kind of nerve that's wanted, and now I rather fancy he's whistling in his flock. Blenkiron consulted a notebook. Pavia, that's the Argentine man, started last month for Europe. He transshipped from a coasting steamer in the West Indies, and we've temporarily lost track of him. But he's left his hunting ground. What do you reckon that means? It means, Blenkiron continued solemnly, that Ivory thinks the game's nearly over. The play's working up for the big climax, and that climax is going to be damnation for the Allies, unless we get a move on. Right, I said. That's what I'm here for. So what's the move? The wild birds mustn't ever go home, and the man they call Ivory or Beaumarts or Chelius has to decease. It's a cold-blooded proposition, but it's him or the world that's got to break. But before he quits this earth, we're bound to get wise about some of his plans, and that means that we can't just shoot a pistol at his face. Also, we've got to find him first. We reckon he's in Switzerland, but that's in a state with quite a lot of diversified scenery to lose a man in. Still, I guess we'll find him. But it's the kind of business to plan out as carefully as a battle. I'm going back to Bern on my old stunt to boss the show, and I'm giving the orders. You're an obedient child, Dick, so I don't reckon on any trouble that way. Then Blenkiron did an ominous thing. He pulled up a little table and started to lay out patience cards. Since his duodenum was cured, he seemed to have dropped that habit, and from his resuming it, I gathered that his mind was uneasy. I can see that the scene as if it were yesterday, the French colonel in an armchair smoking a cigarette in a long amber holder, and Blenkiron sitting primly on the edge of a yellow silk ottoman, dealing his cards and looking guiltily towards me. "You'll have Peter for company," he said. "Peter's a sad man, but he has a great heart, and he's been mighty useful to me already. They're going to move him to England very soon. The authorities are afraid for him, and he's apt to talk wild, his health having made him peevish about the British. But there's a deal of red tape in the world, and the orders for his repatriation are slow in coming." The speaker winked very slowly and deliberately with his left eye. I asked if I was to be with Peter, much cheered at the prospect. "Why, yes. You and Peter are the collateral in the deal, but the big game's not with you." I had a presentiment of something coming, something anxious and unpleasant. "Is Mary in it?" I asked. He nodded, and seemed to pull himself together for an explanation. "See here, Dick. Our main job is to get Ivory back to Allied soil where we can handle him, and there's just one magnet that can fetch him back. You aren't going to deny that?" I felt my face getting very red, and that ugly hammer began beating in my forehead. Two grave, patient eyes met my glare. "I'm damned if I'll allow it," I cried. "I've some right to say in the thing. I won't have Mary made a decoy. It's too infernally degrading." "It isn't pretty. But war isn't pretty, and nothing we do is pretty. I'd have blushed like a rose when I was young and innocent to imagine the things I've put my hand to in the last 3 years. But have you any other way, Dick? I'm not proud. I'll scrap the plan if you can show me another. Night after night I've hammered the thing out, and I can't hit on a better. Hey-ho, Dick, this isn't like you." And he grinned ruefully. "You're making yourself a fine argument in favour of celibacy in time of war. Anyhow, what is it the poet sings? 'White hands cling to the bridle rein, slipping the spur from the booted heel.' I was angry as sin, but I felt all the time I had no case. Blenkiron stopped his game of patience, sending the cards flying over the carpet, and straddled on the hearthrug. "You're never going to be a piker. What's duty, if you won't carry it on to the other side of hell? What's the use of yapping about your country if you're going to keep anything back when she calls for it? What's the good of meaning to win the war, if you don't put every cent you've got on your stake. You'll make me think you're like the Jacks in your English novels that chuck in their hand and say it's up to God, and call that seeing it through. No, Dick, that kind of duty don't deserve a blessing. You don't keep back anything if you want to save your soul. Besides, he went on, what a girl it is. She can't scare, and she can't soil. She's white-hot youth and innocence, and she'd take no more harm than clean steel from a muck-heap. I knew I was badly in the wrong, but my pride was all raw. I'm not going to agree till I've talked to Mary. But Miss Mary has consented, he said gently. She made the plan. Next day, in clear blue weather that might have been May, I drove Mary down to Fontainebleau. We lunched in the inn by the bridge and walked into the forest. I hadn't slept much, for I was tortured by what I thought was anxiety for her, but which was, in truth, jealousy of Ivory. I don't think that I would have minded her risking her life, for that was part of the game we were both in. But I jibed at the notion of Ivory coming near her again. I told myself it was honourable pride, but I knew deep down in me that it was jealousy. I asked her if she had accepted Blencaron's plan, and she turned mischievous eyes on me. I knew I should have a scene with you, Dick. I told Mr. Blencaron so. Of course I agreed. I'm not even very much afraid of it. I'm a member of the team, you know, and I must play up to my form. I can't do a man's work, so all the more reason why I should tackle the thing I can do. But, I stammered, it's such a degrading business for a child like you. I can't bear it. It makes me hot to think of it. Her reply was merry laughter. You're an old Ottoman, Dick. You haven't doubled Cape Turk yet, and I don't believe you're round Surglio Point. Why, women aren't the brittle things men used to think them. They never were, and the war has made them like whipcord. Bless you, my dear. We're the tougher sex now. We've had to wait and endure, and we've been so beaten on the anvil of patience that we've lost all our McGims. She put her hands on my shoulders and looked me in the eye. Look at me, Dick. You're at some day to be a spouse saint. I'm 19 years of age next August. Before the war, I should only just put my hair up. I should have been the kind of shivering debutante who blushes when spoken to, and, oh, I should have thought such silly, silly things about life. Well, in the last 2 years, I've been close to it, and to death. I've nursed the dying. I've seen souls in agony and in triumph. England has allowed me to serve her as she allows her sons. Oh, I'm a robust young woman now, and indeed I think women were always robuster than men. Dick, dear Dick, we're lovers, but we're comrades too, always comrades, and comrades trust each other. I hadn't anything to say, except contrition, for I'd had my lesson. I'd been slipping away in my thoughts with the gravity of our task, and Mary had brought me back to it. I remember that as we walked through the woodland we came to a place where there were no signs of war. Elsewhere there were men busy felling trees, and anti-aircraft guns, and an occasional transport wagon. But here there was only a shallow grassy vale, and in the distance bloomed over like a plum in the evening haze the roofs of an old dwelling-house amongst the gardens. Mary clung to my arm as we drank in the peace of it. "That is what lies for us at the end of the road, Dick," she said softly. And then, as she looked, I felt her body shiver. She returned to the strange fancy she'd had in St. Germain's Woods 3 days before. "Somewhere it's waiting for us, and we shall certainly find it. But first we must go through the Valley of the Shadow, and there is the sacrifice to be made, the best of us." And now it's time to get back to The King in Yellow. This is part 5 of Rue Barrée, and the very final part of The King in Yellow. It took Clifford a month to entirely recover, although at the end of the first week he was pronounced convalescent by Elliot, who was an authority, and his convalescence was aided by the cordiality with which Rue Barrée acknowledged his solemn salutes. 40 times a day he blessed Rue Barré for her refusal, and thanked his lucky stars, and at the same time, oh, wondrous heart of ours, he suffered the tortures of the blighted. Elliot was annoyed, partly by Clifford's reticence, partly by the unexplainable thaw in the frigidity of Rue Barré. At their frequent encounters, when she, tripping along the Rue de Seine, with music roll and big straw hat, would pass Clifford and his familiars steering an easterly course to the Café Vachat, and at the respectful uncovering of the band would colour and smile at Clifford, Elliot's slumbering suspicions awoke. But he never found out anything, and finally gave it up as beyond his comprehension, merely qualifying Clifford as an idiot and reserving his opinion of Rue Barré. And all this time Selby was jealous. At first he refused to acknowledge it to himself, and cut the studio for a day in the country. But the woods and fields of course aggravated his case, and the brooks babbled of Rue Barré, and the mowers calling to each other across the meadow ended in a quivering Rue Barré. That day, spent in the country, made him angry for a week, and he worked sulkily at Julian's, all the time tormented by a desire to know where Clifford was and what he might be doing. This culminated in an erratic stroll on Sunday, which ended at the flower market on the Pont de Change, began again, was gloomily extended to the morgue, and again ended at the Marble Bridge. It would never do, and Selby felt it, so he went to see Clifford, who was convalescing on mint juleps in his garden. They sat down together and discussed morals and human happiness, and each found the other most entertaining. Only Selby failed to pump Clifford to the other's unfeigned amusement. But the juleps spread balm on the sting of jealousy, and trickled hope to the blighted, and when Selby said he must go, Clifford went too, and when Selby, not to be outdone, insisted on accompanying Clifford back to his door, Clifford determined to see Selby back halfway, and then, finding it hard to part, they decided to dine together and flit. To flit, a verb meaning and applied to Clifford's nocturnal prowls, expressed perhaps as well as anything the gaiety proposed. Dinner was ordered at Mignon's, and while Selby interviewed the chef, Clifford kept a fatherly eye on the butler. The dinner was a success. All was of the sort generally termed a success. Toward the dessert, Selby heard someone say at a great distance, "Kid Selby, drunk as a lord." A group of men passed near them. It seemed to him that he shook hands and laughed a great deal, and that everybody was very witty. There was Clifford opposite, swearing undying confidence in his chum Selby, and there seemed to be others there, either seated beside them or continually passing with the swish of skirts on the polished floor. The perfume of roses, the rustle of fans, the touch of rounded arms, and the laughter grew vaguer and vaguer. The room seemed enveloped in mist. Then, all in a moment, each object stood out painfully distinct. Only forms and visages were distorted, and voices piercing. He drew himself up, calm, grave, and for the moment master of himself, but very drunk. He knew he was drunk, and was as guarded and alert, as keenly suspicious of himself as he would have been of a thief at his elbow. His self-command enabled Clifford to hold his head safely under some running water, and repair to the street, considerably the worse for wear, but never suspecting that his companion was drunk. For a time he kept his self-command. His face was only a bit paler, a bit tighter than usual. He was only a trifle slower and more fastidious in his speech. It was midnight when he left Clifford, peacefully slumbering in somebody's armchair with a long suede glove dangling in his hand, and a plumy boa twisted about his neck to protect his throat from the draughts. He walked through the hall and down the stairs, and found himself on the sidewalk in a quarter he did not know. Mechanically, he looked up at the name of the street. The name was not familiar. He turned and steered his course towards some lights clustered at the end of the street. They proved farther away than he had anticipated, and after a long quest he came to the conclusion that his eyes had been mysteriously removed from their proper places, and had been reset on either side of his head like those of a bird. It grieved him to think of the inconvenience of this transformation which it might occasion him, and he attempted to cock his head up like a hen to test the mobility of his neck. Then an immense despair stole over him. Tears gathered in the tear ducts. His heart melted, and he collided with a tree. This shocked him into comprehension. He stifled the violent tenderness in his breast, picked up his hat, and moved on more briskly. His mouth was white and drawn, his teeth tightly clinched. He held his course pretty well, and strayed but little, and after an apparently indeterminable length of time found himself passing a line of cabs. The brilliant lamps, red, yellow, and green, annoyed him, and he felt it might be pleasant to demolish them with his cane. But mastering this impulse, he passed on. Later, an idea struck him that it would save fatigue to take a cab, and he started back with that intention. But the cabs seemed already so far away, and the lanterns were so bright and confusing, that he gave it up, and pulling himself together, looked around. A shadow, a mass, huge and undefined, rose to his right. He recognized the Arc de Triomphe, and gravely shook his cane at it. Its size annoyed him. He felt it was too big. And then he heard something fall, clattering to the pavement, and thought probably it was his cane, but it didn't much matter. When he had mastered himself and regained control of his right leg, which betrayed symptoms of insubordination, he found himself traversing the Place de la Concorde at a pace which threatened to land him at the Madeleine. This would never do. He turned sharply to the right, and crossing the bridge, passed the Palais Bourbon at a trot, and wheeled into the Boulevard Saint-Germain. He got on well enough, although the size of the War Office struck him as a personal insult, and he missed his cane, which it would have been pleasant to drag along the iron railings as he passed. It occurred to him, however, to substitute his hat, but when he found it, he'd forgot what he wanted it for, and replaced it upon his head with gravity. Then he was obliged to battle with a violent inclination to sit down and weep. This lasted until he came to the Rue de Rennes. But there he became absorbed in contemplating the dragon on the balcony overhanging the Cour de Dragon. And time slipped away until he remembered vaguely that he had no business there, and marched off again. It was slow work. The inclination to sit down and weep had given place to a desire for solitary and deep reflection. Here his right leg forgot its obedience, and attacking the left outflanked it and brought him up against a wooden board, which seemed to bar his path. He tried to walk around it, but found the street closed. He tried to push it over, and found he couldn't. Then he noticed a red lantern standing on a pile of paving stones beside the barrier. This was pleasant. How was he to get home if the boulevard was blocked? But he was not on the boulevard. His treacherous right leg had beguiled him into a detour, for there behind him lay the boulevard with its endless line of lamps, and here, what was this narrow, dilapidated street piled up with earth and mortar and heaps of stone? He looked up. Written in staring black letters on the barrier was Rue Barré. He sat down. 2 policemen whom he knew came by and advised him to get up, but he argued the question from a standpoint of personal taste, and they passed on, laughing. For he was at that moment absorbed in a problem. It was how to see Rue Barré. She was somewhere or other in that big house with the iron balconies, and the door was locked. But what of that? The simple idea struck him to shout until she came. This idea was replaced by another equally lucid, to hammer on the door until she came. But finally, rejecting both of these as too uncertain, he decided to climb into the balcony, and opening a window politely inquire for Rue Barré. There was but one lighted window in the house that he could see. It was on the 2nd floor, and towards this he cast his eyes. Then, mounting the wooden barrier, and clambering over the piles of stones, he reached the sidewalk, and looked up at the facade for a foothold. It seemed impossible. But a sudden fury seized him, a blind, drunken obstinacy, and the blood rushed to his head, leaping, beating in his ears like a dull thunder of an ocean. He set his teeth, and springing at a window-sill, dragged himself up and hung to the iron bars. Then reason fled. There surged in his brain the sound of many voices. His heart leaped up, beating a mad tattoo, and gripping at the cornice and ledge he worked his way along the facade, clung to the pipes and shutters, and dragged himself up, over, and into the balcony by the lighted window. His hat fell off and rolled against the pane. For a moment he leaned breathless against the railing. Then the window was slowly opened from within. They stared at each other for some time. Presently the girl took 2 unsteady steps back into the room. He saw her face, all crimsoned now. He saw her sink into a chair by the lamp-lit table, and without a word he followed her into the room, closing the big door like panes behind him. Then they looked at each other in silence. The room was small and white. Everything was white about it. The curtained bed, the little washstand in the corner, the bare walls, the china lamp, and his own face, had he known it. But the face and neck of Rue were surging in the colour that dyed the blossoming rose tree there on the hearth beside her. It did not occur to him to speak. She seemed not to expect it. His mind was struggling with the impressions of the room. The whiteness, the extreme purity of everything occupied him, began to trouble him. As his eye became accustomed to the light, other objects grew from the surroundings and took their places in the circle of lamplight. There was a piano and a coal scuttle, and a little iron trunk with a bathtub, and there was a row of wooden pegs against the door, with a white chintz curtain covering the clothes beneath. On the bed lay an umbrella and a big straw hat, and on the table a music roll unfurled, an inkstand, and sheets of ruled paper. Behind him stood a wardrobe, faced with a mirror, but somehow he did not care to see his own face just then. He was sobering. The girl sat, looking at him without a word. Her face was expressionless, yet the lips at times trembled almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, so wonderfully blue in the daylight, seemed dark and soft as velvet, and the colour on her neck deepened and whitened with every breath. She seemed smaller and more slender than when he had seen her in the street, and there was now something in the curve of her cheek almost infantine. When at last he turned and caught his own reflection in the mirror behind him, a shock passed through him as though he had seen a shameful thing, and his clouded mind and his clouded thoughts grew clearer. For a moment their eyes met, and then his sought the floor, his lips tightened, and the struggle within him bowed his head and strained every nerve to the breaking. And now it was over, for the voice within had spoken. He listened, dully interested, but already knowing the end. Indeed, it little mattered. The end would always be the same for him, he understood now, always the same for him, and he listened, dully interested, to a voice which grew within him. After a while he stood up. She rose at once, one small hand resting on the table. Presently he opened the window, picked up his hat and shut it again, and then he went over to the rose bush and touched the blossoms with his face. One was standing in a glass of water on the table, and mechanically the girl drew it out, pressed it with her lips, and laid it on the table beside him. He took it without a word, and crossing the room opened the door. The landing was dark and silent, but the girl lifted the lamp, and gliding past him, slipped down the polished stairs to the hallway. Then, unchaining the bolts, she drew open the iron wicket. Through this he passed with his rose. And that was a beautiful ending to The King in Yellow. It's been a long ride, this book. We started this back in mid-December 2014, and now it's the end of February 2016. I feel pushed to say that I felt there was a hidden message in that final part, although I can't quite define it. Was the white room the reflection of the protagonist's purity? And Rue never touched him, but kissed a rose, which he took. An understanding of some sort passed there, and it leaves me wondering if Rue even actually existed. Was she just a metaphor, shut away behind the barriers at the end of the street? Perhaps I'll never know. That's all for today. Opening music was provided by Victor Valdez from the Symbol Project. This file is released on an attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives license. So, until next time.
CthulhuPodcast.co.uk